My stepdaughter called me a gold digger at her father's retirement banquet. She was 16, old enough to understand what the words meant, young enough to believe they were true. The ballroom fell silent. Nearly 300 people had gathered to celebrate Colonel Daniel Carter's retirement after 28 years in the Army. Friends, soldiers, neighbors, business leaders. Even the mayor had shown up. Daniel stood beside me, frozen. Emily, my stepdaughter, kept staring at me, as if she'd finally found the courage to say what everyone else had been thinking. "You don't deserve any of this," she said, loud enough for every table to hear. "You married Dad because he was successful." A nervous laugh escaped somewhere in the back of the room. Then it disappeared. No one moved. No one spoke. Daniel looked from Emily to me, waiting for one of us to say something. Instead, another voice broke the silence. "She's right." It came from Daniel's mother, Margaret. She slowly rose from her chair and adjusted the pearl necklace around her neck. "I've kept quiet for years," she said calmly, "but someone needed to tell the truth." She looked directly at me. "You were never here for Daniel. You were here for what he could give you." A few people nodded. Others avoided my eyes. I stood there, holding the crystal plaque Daniel had received only minutes earlier. The words on it blurred together. 23 years of marriage. Gone. Reduced to one sentence. Gold digger. I could have defended myself. I could have reminded everyone that I'd worked full-time our entire marriage, that I'd paid every mortgage payment since Emily was 2, that Daniel's military salary had supported deployments, retirement accounts, and college savings, while my paycheck quietly kept a roof over our heads. Instead, I set the plaque back on the table. Then I asked one question. "Daniel?" I looked at my husband. "Do you still have the blue ledger?" Confusion spread across the room. Daniel didn't answer immediately. His face had gone pale. He knew exactly which ledger I meant. It wasn't a diary. It wasn't a photo album. It was the notebook we'd started 21 years earlier when we bought our first home. Every mortgage payment, every bank transfer, every repair, every tax bill, every sacrifice, written down by hand, because Daniel believed memories faded. Paper didn't. Margaret frowned. "What ledger?" Daniel finally found his voice. He swallowed. "It's in the study." I nodded. "Would you bring it?" The ballroom remained perfectly still as Daniel walked toward the exit. Margaret folded her arms. "A notebook isn't going to change anything." I met her eyes for the first time that evening. "No, it won't. But the truth might. Before anyone called me a gold digger, if you'd met us 23 years earlier, you would have laughed at the idea that I married Daniel for money. There wasn't any. He was a young Army captain, renting a tiny duplex just outside Fort Hood. The air conditioner rattled so loudly at night, we sometimes had to pause our conversations until it stopped. The kitchen was barely large enough for 2 people. Whenever we cooked together, one of us inevitably bumped into the refrigerator. Daniel always claimed it was my fault. I insisted it was his. Neither of us ever won that argument. We met because my car broke down. Not outside a fancy restaurant. Not at some charity gala. In the parking lot of a grocery store. I was 26, teaching 8th grade history at a public middle school, and driving a 10-year-old Honda that chose the hottest day of July to die. Smoke poured from the hood. I stared at it for a full minute before admitting I had absolutely no idea what to do. Then someone behind me said, "I don't think it's supposed to do that." I turned around to find a man in army fatigues, carrying 2 bags of groceries. He smiled. I could be wrong. "But engines usually don't smoke unless they're protesting." I laughed, mostly because I was too frustrated to cry. That was Daniel. He could make a stranger laugh in under 30 seconds. He spent the next hour helping me push the car into the shade. He borrowed a wrench from another customer, called a mechanic friend, then insisted on driving me home because the Texas heat was climbing past 100 degrees. Before I got out of his truck, he handed me a folded receipt. His phone number was written across the back. "In case the mechanic overcharges you." I looked at him. "That's why you're giving me your number?" He shrugged. I panicked. I had a better line prepared in my head. "What was it?" He smiled. "I'll tell you on the second date." There almost wasn't one. The mechanic repaired my car 2 days later. I thanked Daniel over the phone. We talked for nearly an hour. Neither of us wanted to hang up. Still, weeks passed before either of us admitted we were waiting for the other to ask. Eventually he did. Our first date cost less than $20. Cheap Mexican food. a walk through a riverside park. One shared ice cream because neither of us wanted to pay for two. By the end of the night, Daniel confessed something that made me laugh harder than any joke he'd told. I never actually had a second date line. So you lied? I improvised. You weren't very good at it. I know. But you still came. I did. He grinned. So technically, my strategy worked. People often imagine military marriages as grand romances, filled with uniforms, homecomings, and dramatic airport reunions. Most of ours looked much simpler. Laundry folded after midnight. Cold coffee reheated 3 times. Bills spread across the kitchen table. Trying to fit a lifetime into weekends before another deployment stole him away. We learned early that love wasn't measured by vacations or expensive gifts. It lived in ordinary things. The lunch he'd pack before leaving at dawn. The sticky notes he'd hide inside my lesson planner. The way he'd always scrape the ice off my windshield before his own. Years later, people would look at our house and assume success had come easily. They never saw the years before it. The secondhand furniture. The canceled holidays. The summers I spent tutoring students because teachers didn't earn enough. Or the nights Daniel worked extra military training assignments just to build a little savings. We weren't building wealth. We were building stability. There is a difference. When Emily was born, everything changed. She was only 2 when Daniel received orders for another overseas deployment. We sat at the kitchen table long after she'd fallen asleep. A calculator rested between us. So, Daniel said quietly, we need a plan. I already knew what he meant. His military pay would continue. Mine would too. But daycare, travel, repairs, unexpected expenses. Life had a habit of arriving all at once. I opened my notebook. What if my paycheck covers the mortgage? He frowned. That's a lot. So is asking you to worry about bills from another continent. He looked down at the calculator. I don't like it. I know. But we'll know the house is always safe. He stayed quiet for almost a minute. Then he reached across the table and squeezed my hand. When this deployment ends, I'll make it up to you. I smiled. You don't owe me anything. He shook his head. I do. Neither of us realized that one quiet conversation over a scratched kitchen table would become the center of a courtroom decades later. At the time, it felt like nothing more than 2 exhausted parents trying to make the numbers work. It was never about pride. It was never about keeping score. It was simply the life we chose together. And for years, it worked. The cracks no one else could see. For the first few years, our arrangement stayed exactly as we'd planned. Every month, my paycheck covered the mortgage. Daniel's military income paid for everything else. Utilities, groceries, insurance, Emily's preschool, and whatever surprises life decided to throw at us. Neither of us kept score. We didn't need to. Marriage wasn't an accounting exercise, at least, not to us. Still, Daniel insisted on recording every payment in a blue leather ledger he'd bought at an office supply store. I teased him about it constantly. Who still writes things down by hand? He'd grin without looking up. People who don't trust computers. You work with satellites. I trust satellites. I don't trust hard drives. By the end of every month, he'd slide the notebook across the table for me to check. Everything right? I'd glance at the latest entry, nod, and hand it back. It became one of those tiny rituals couples build without realizing it. As ordinary as brushing your teeth before bed. The first person who questioned our arrangement wasn't a banker. It wasn't a lawyer. It was Daniel's mother. Margaret had never been openly cruel to me. She preferred something far more effective. Questions. Questions that sounded harmless until you noticed they all pointed in the same direction. One Sunday afternoon, she arrived with a homemade peach pie. Emily ran to hug her grandmother while Daniel helped carry groceries inside. Margaret wandered into the kitchen where I was putting dishes away. So, she glanced toward the dining room to make sure Daniel couldn't hear. How are you two handling money these days? I smiled. The same way we always have. And what way is that? We both work. We both pay bills. She nodded slowly. I suppose that's modern. I laughed. I guess. Then she opened the refrigerator and said, almost casually, I always imagined a husband would want to provide for his family. The words weren't loud. They weren't angry. They simply settled into the room like dust. Easy to ignore. Impossible to forget. I mentioned it to Daniel after she left. He sighed before I'd even finished. I'm sorry. You don't have to apologize. I know exactly what she meant. Then why does she keep saying things like that? He rubbed the back of his neck. She grew up differently. So did I. He smiled faintly. I know. My dad handled every bill. My mom stayed home. And your mother thinks every marriage should look the same. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The comments became more frequent after Daniel's promotions. Each new rank brought a larger paycheck. A nicer neighborhood. Better schools for Emily. To people on the outside, it looked obvious. Military officer, teacher. Surely he was supporting everyone. They didn't know my salary had quietly paid the mortgage every single month. They never asked. And we never corrected them. At first, it felt unnecessary. Then it became awkward. Eventually, it simply became normal. Looking back, silence wasn't neutral. Silence lets other people write the story for you. 5 years after buying the house, Daniel was deployed again. Emily had just turned 7. She insisted on helping him pack. Every stuffed animal she owned somehow ended up inside his duffel bag. You can't take all of these, Daniel laughed. I need them. So do I. She crossed her arms. You'll get lonely. I probably will. So take the bear. And the rabbit. And Mr. Pickles. Daniel looked at me helplessly. I think I've been outvoted. You have. We left the stuffed animals exactly where Emily had hidden them. Months later, Daniel admitted the men in his unit had laughed when they found them. Then one by one, they started asking if they could borrow one during long nights. Turns out, he told me over the phone, grown soldiers miss home too. Deployments taught us something most people never have to learn. Routine keeps fear from taking over. Friday nights belonged to Daniel's favorite Western movies, even if Emily and I spent half the time making fun of them. Sunday calls came whenever satellite connections cooperated. Sometimes we talked for 40 minutes. Sometimes the connection dropped after 40 seconds. Either way, hearing his voice reminded us that somewhere on the other side of the world, he was still trying to come home. Margaret began stopping by more often. She brought dinner, picked Emily up from school once when faculty meetings kept me late, even offered to mow the lawn after our old riding mower refused to start. At the time, I appreciated every bit of it. Only later did I notice the pattern. Each favor came with a conversation. Each conversation drifted toward the same subject: family. One evening she found me balancing the household budget at the kitchen table. She poured herself a cup of coffee before speaking. You shouldn't have to carry all this alone. I'm managing. I know. She studied the numbers for a moment. Daniel's always taken care of the people he loves. I smiled. He has. No. She looked up. I mean financially. I closed the notebook. We take care of each other. She smiled politely. Of course. But people respect a man who provides. There it was again. Not criticism. A correction. As though our marriage needed to fit a picture she'd already painted years before. A month later, Daniel called from overseas. The connection crackled so badly, I could barely make out every third word. After we talked about Emily's science project and the dog chewing another pair of shoes, his voice changed. Mom's been calling. I figured. She's worried. About what? A pause. She thinks you're working too hard. I am. I know. So why is she telling you instead of me? He exhaled slowly. She thinks people should know I've been taking care of everything. The words hung between us. I leaned back in my chair. What does that even mean? I asked her not to mention the mortgage. My stomach tightened. You what? I didn't want people getting the wrong idea. What wrong idea? That my wife was paying for the house. I stared at the dark kitchen window. So, you were embarrassed? No. I was proud of you. It doesn't sound like it. He stayed quiet. Finally, he said the one thing I knew he'd regret. I didn't want people thinking I couldn't provide. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Outside, sprinklers clicked across the front lawn. Inside, 20 years of partnership suddenly felt a little more fragile. I never wanted credit, I said softly. I know. I just wanted us to tell the truth. I know. His voice cracked. When I come home, we'll fix it. The next morning an email arrived. It contained only 3 sentences. I'm sorry. You carried more than anyone knows. When I get home, we tell the truth. I printed the email without really knowing why. Then I slipped it inside the blue ledger. Not because I thought we'd ever need proof. Because something inside me wanted those words to exist somewhere beyond a computer screen. It would become one of the smartest decisions I'd ever make. I just didn't know it yet. A week later, Margaret introduced me to one of Daniel's cousins after church. "This is Sarah," she said warmly. "She's been keeping busy while Daniel provides for the family overseas." The cousin smiled. "So nice to meet you." I smiled back. Then I realized no one in that conversation had actually lied. They'd simply left out the most important part. Sometimes omission is the most convincing form of deception. I drove home that afternoon with an uneasy feeling I couldn't explain. For the first time in our marriage, I wondered whether telling the truth later might already be too late. The day everything changed. The knock came on a Tuesday. Gray skies, cold coffee, sitting untouched beside my lesson plans. Emily had already left for school, complaining that I'd packed carrot sticks instead of potato chips in her lunch. It felt like every ordinary morning we'd lived through before, until someone knocked on the front door. 3 slow knocks. Not hurried, not uncertain, measured, professional. My stomach tightened before I even reached the hallway. Military families learn to recognize that rhythm. You never forget it. I opened the door. 2 Army officers stood on the porch. One held his service cap against his chest. The other avoided my eyes. I don't remember inviting them inside. I don't remember sitting down. I only remember one sentence. "We regret to inform you." The rest dissolved into silence. Somewhere in the kitchen, the coffee maker beeped. The sound seemed impossibly loud. One officer kept speaking. Words like heroism, service, sacrifice floated through the room without meaning anything. Daniel couldn't be dead. We'd spoken 2 nights earlier. He'd laughed because Emily had accidentally mailed him one of her math worksheets instead of the family photo she'd meant to include. He'd promised to call again on Sunday. People who promise to call on Sunday don't disappear on Tuesday. Not in real life. The officers stayed until my sister arrived. Apparently I'd called her. I have no memory of making that phone call. Grief has a strange way of erasing ordinary moments while preserving tiny, meaningless ones forever. I remember noticing one officer's shoelace had come untied. I remember apologizing because I hadn't offered them coffee. I remember staring at the clock in the living room, convinced it had stopped. It hadn't. Time was simply moving without asking my permission. Emily came home early from school. She stepped through the front door, saw 2 unfamiliar cars in the driveway, and immediately looked at me. Children know. Before anyone speaks, before anyone explains, they know. She dropped her backpack. "Mom?" I couldn't answer. She looked from me to the folded American flag resting on the dining room table. Then back to me. No. It wasn't a question. No. She backed away slowly. No. By the 3rd time, her voice had broken. I crossed the room and wrapped my arms around her. She fought me for exactly 2 seconds. Then she collapsed against my shoulder. "Did he know?" she whispered. The question caught me off guard. "What? Did Dad know? That we loved him?" I buried my face in her hair. Every single day. She cried until neither of us had any tears left. The next week passed in fragments. Neighbors brought casseroles we barely touched. Teachers covered my classes without asking how long I'd be gone. Parents from Emily's soccer team quietly mowed our lawn. The mailbox filled with sympathy cards from people I'd never met. Some had served with Daniel 20 years earlier. Others knew him only through someone else. Each letter described a different version of the same man. Leader, mentor, friend, protector. I read every one. None of them mentioned the mortgage. None of them mentioned money. That wasn't how people remembered him. Margaret arrived every morning. She answered phone calls, organized flowers, spoke with the funeral home, handled details I didn't have the strength to think about. For a while, I believed we were grieving together. Then, 3 days after Daniel's death, she walked into the kitchen carrying a stack of paperwork. The insurance forms came. I looked up. "I know. We should review them." "We?" She hesitated. "The family." I stared at her. "My husband died 72 hours ago. I'm aware. I'm trying to help." Her voice stayed perfectly calm. Too calm. I pushed the papers back across the table. "They can wait." She didn't argue. She simply gathered the documents, smoothed the edges, and placed them back into the folder. As she turned to leave, she said quietly, "Money has a way of making people impatient." The words sat with me long after she'd gone upstairs. At the time, I assumed she was talking about distant relatives. I never imagined she meant me. Daniel's memorial filled the chapel beyond capacity. Uniformed soldiers lined both aisles. Emily clutched my hand so tightly my fingers went numb. Colonel James Walker stood near the front, staring straight ahead. When the honor guard folded the American flag, the room was so silent I could hear someone crying 3 rows behind us. The flag was placed in my hands. "This flag is presented on behalf of a grateful nation." The young soldier's voice trembled only once. I nodded, because I couldn't trust myself to speak. After the service, friends gathered in the fellowship hall. People shared stories. Daniel teaching a young lieutenant how to tie a proper necktie. Daniel staying late to help another soldier study for promotion exams. Daniel driving 3 hours to fix a fellow veteran's broken furnace. Every story ended the same way. That's just who he was. I smiled through tears. For one brief afternoon, grief felt almost bearable. Then Margaret stood. She tapped a spoon against her glass. "I'd like to say a few words." The conversations faded. She smiled sadly. "My son dedicated his life to serving others." Heads nodded around the room. "He worked harder than anyone I've ever known." More nods. "And because of that hard work," she turned toward me, "he made sure his family never wanted for anything." I felt something tighten in my chest. She continued, "That's why it's especially painful to watch people benefit from sacrifices they never truly understood." The room went still. I could hear my own heartbeat. Margaret looked directly at me. "My son believed in taking care of people. Unfortunately, not everyone loved him for who he was. Some loved what he could provide." No one breathed. Emily's hand slipped from mine. She stared at her grandmother in disbelief. Margaret didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Then she said the sentence that would follow me for months. "I hope Daniel never realized he married a woman who loved his paycheck more than she loved him." A fork clattered onto the floor somewhere behind me. No one bent to pick it up. I looked around the room. Some people looked horrified. Others looked confused. A few looked as though they'd suspected it all along. Rumors don't begin the day they're spoken aloud. They begin years earlier, one careful conversation at a time. Emily stepped forward before I could stop her. "Grandma." Her voice shook. "That's not true." Margaret looked at her gently. "Oh, sweetheart. I know this is hard." Emily took another step. "No, you don't know. My dad loved Mom." Margaret sighed. "He did. That's what made him vulnerable." I saw Emily's face change. Not into anger, into heartbreak. Children expect adults to tell the truth. Watching one grandparent accuse the other person they trust most changes something inside them, something that never quite goes back. I wanted to defend myself. I wanted to scream. Instead, I heard Daniel's voice in my head. Paper doesn't forget. The blue ledger. Still sitting in the study, waiting. I looked at Colonel Walker. He was already watching me. Almost imperceptibly, he nodded, as if he knew exactly what I was thinking. I turned back to Margaret. "You've said your piece." She folded her arms. "I have." I took a slow breath. "Then tomorrow, I'll tell mine." And for the first time since Daniel died, I wasn't thinking about surviving. I was thinking about proving the truth. The truth was never hidden. It was simply ignored. Rebecca Lawson never promised we would win. She refused to make promises she couldn't keep. Instead, she spread every document across the conference table and asked a single question. What can we prove? Not what we believed. Not what felt fair. Not what Daniel would have wanted. Proof. Courts didn't reward grief. They rewarded evidence. For 3 weeks, we searched through 23 years of paperwork. Tax returns, mortgage statements, insurance records, canceled checks, retirement documents. Most of it confirmed what I'd always known. Every mortgage payment had come from my teaching salary. Every single one. Yet Rebecca never celebrated. "Good," she would say, placing another document into a growing stack. "But this only proves you paid. It doesn't prove Daniel intended the house to remain yours." That sentence haunted me. Because she was right. Margaret wasn't claiming I'd never contributed. She was claiming Daniel had only allowed me to help until he retired, that the house had always been meant to return to his side of the family. It sounded absurd. Until I remembered something Daniel used to say. Write it down. His study had barely changed since the day he died. The same coffee mug still sat beside the window. The same reading glasses rested on top of an unfinished military history book. Dust covered everything except one shelf. The blue leather ledger. I lifted it carefully. The pages smelled faintly of old paper and cedar. Every month had its own entry. Mortgage, insurance, property tax, roof repair, new water heater. Nothing had been forgotten. Halfway through the ledger, an envelope slipped onto the floor. Then another. Then a bundle of folded pages tied together with faded green string. Rebecca crouched beside me. What are those? I stared at Daniel's handwriting. I don't know. The first envelope carried only one word. Mom. Inside wasn't a letter Margaret had written. It was one Daniel had never mailed. He had copied it by hand before sealing the original. Rebecca unfolded the paper slowly. By the third paragraph, she stopped reading aloud. Her eyes met mine. Sarah, you need to hear this. She started again. Mom, I need you to stop telling people I bought this house by myself. Sarah has paid every mortgage payment since Emily was little. That wasn't charity. It was our decision. If anyone deserves credit for keeping this home alive, it's my wife. The room fell silent. I reached for another letter. This one was dated 3 years later. Again addressed to Margaret. Again, never spoken about. Please don't embarrass Sarah by pretending she contributes less than she does. She insisted we build our future together. One day, Emily deserves to know the truth. Rebecca didn't say anything for nearly a minute. Finally, she whispered, she knew. I nodded slowly. She's always known. The courtroom wasn't crowded. No television cameras, no reporters. Just family, lawyers, a judge who had probably heard every version of human dishonesty imaginable. Margaret entered wearing black, composed enough that anyone watching might mistake confidence for grief. Her attorney arranged neat stacks of documents without once looking toward us. They believed the facts favored them, or perhaps they believed confidence could replace facts. Rebecca simply placed the blue ledger on our table. Nothing else. She smiled at me. Let them talk first. They did. Margaret's attorney painted a familiar picture. A decorated army officer. A devoted son. A grieving mother. A widow who, according to him, had misunderstood years of financial support. Then he sat down. Rebecca stood. No speeches, Your Honor. Just evidence. She called no dramatic witnesses. She began with bank records. 23 years. 23 years of mortgage payments. Everyone traced to my account. Next came the property deed. Joint ownership. Executed years before Daniel's final deployment. Finally, she held up the bundle of letters. We believe these speak for themselves. The judge adjusted his glasses. Proceed. Rebecca handed him the first letter. The courtroom became so quiet I could hear pages turning. Then another, and another. Each letter told the same story. Not once, not twice, but over nearly a decade. Daniel had repeatedly asked his mother to stop rewriting the truth. She never did. Colonel James Walker took the stand. He wasn't emotional. He didn't need to be. Did Sergeant Daniel Carter ever discuss the mortgage with you? Yes. What did he say? Walker answered without hesitation. He said his wife paid every mortgage payment. And how certain are you? Walker opened a military planning folder. Because he asked me to witness this. Inside was Daniel's handwritten family planning memorandum. One sentence had been underlined. Sarah keeps this house standing. Never let anyone tell Emily otherwise. Rebecca said nothing more. She didn't need to. The truth had finally found its own voice. The judge looked toward Margaret. Were you aware of these letters? A pause. Then another. Finally. Yes. Were you aware your son repeatedly corrected your statements? Yes. And yet you continued telling family members he alone provided for the home. Margaret lowered her eyes. I thought... She stopped. What did you think? I thought people respected him more that way. The judge leaned back. Respect built on falsehood rarely survives the truth. The ruling took less than 15 minutes. The impact lasted forever. The court finds no basis for disturbing Mrs. Sarah Carter's ownership of the property. The petition is denied. No applause followed. No celebration. Only the quiet sound of folders closing. Justice rarely announces itself. Sometimes, it sounds like paperwork ending. Outside the courthouse, the Texas sky had finally cleared. Colonel Walker caught up with me before I reached my car. I almost forgot. He handed me a small photograph. Daniel, Emily, me, standing in front of our house the day we mailed the final mortgage payment. I turned it over. On the back, in Daniel's unmistakable handwriting, were 7 words. Home isn't bought. It's built together. For the first time since losing him. I smiled without forcing it. A year has passed. Emily is taller now. She still forgets to rinse cereal bowls. She still straightens the American flag outside before leaving for school. Some habits survive grief. Others grow from it. People sometimes ask whether I forgave Margaret. I tell them the truth. Forgiveness isn't the same as trust. One lets you sleep at night. The other has to be earned. The blue ledger now rests in a fireproof safe. Not because I expect another lawsuit. Because one day Emily will inherit it. Not as evidence, but as a reminder. The strongest foundations aren't made of concrete. They're built from quiet sacrifices no one applauds, promises kept when no one is watching, and the courage to protect the truth, even when it would be easier to stay silent. Daniel didn't leave me a fortune. He left me something far more valuable. Proof that love isn't measured by who earns the most. It's measured by who keeps showing up, month after month, year after year. And every time I unlock the front door, I remember the last thing he ever wrote about the place we built together. Home isn't bought. It's built together.